Today we have a sports psychologist in to speak to us about the issue of aggression in sport. Could you please give us some examples of aggression in sport that may occur?
Aggressive behaviour is seen in sport in multiple different ways. Football as a sport is a good example of a sport where aggression occurs quite often. A player might become aggressive towards the referee when he makes a call the player does not agree with, which then causes the player to become abusive, usually verbally, to try and psychologically intimidate or hurt the referee. There can also often be player-on-player aggression if one of them puts in a dirty tackle on the other. This could lead to, again, verbal aggression or sometimes even escalate further to physical violence against each other.
How would aggression be defined as a behaviour?
There are multiple different definitions of aggression. One example of one is any behaviour that is intended to harm another individual by physical or verbal means. This was stated by Bull in 1990. He clearly believes aggression is just simply harmful behaviour verbally or physically. However, there are other definitions as well, one of which is aggression is the display of an intentionally harmful physical action rather than a cognitive or affective state, stated by Todd, Thatcher and Rahman in 2010. They all clearly believe aggressive behaviour is only physical. It is clear that there is no definite definition of what aggression is, which shows how complex a thing it is, as we cannot even come to a consensus of what it is. Gill, in 1986, developed 4 criteria to outline what aggression actually is. The first criteria is that it has to be physical or verbal behaviour, for example, punching somebody or using offensive language towards them, such as swearing or racial comments. The second, that it must cause harm or injury. Harm could be psychological, for example, making somebody doubt themselves, and injury is causing an actual impairment to somebody, and in sport, therefore inhibiting them from playing. The third criteria is that it actually has to be directed towards a living being. If it was towards an object, this would not count as aggression according to Gill. The final criteria is that the action carried out must be intentional, meaning the harm or injury must have been carried out on purpose towards the individual or individuals.
Is aggression always the same, or does it vary?
There are multiple types of aggression, so yes, it can vary, usually depending on the person's intention. One type of aggression is hostile aggression. As stated by Todd, Thatcher and Rahman, hostile aggression is an act of harmful intent without the desire to achieve a competitive benefit. There are often motives behind why someone is aggressive, and for this type the motive would be to harm or injure their opponent. This can often find the pain or damage they cause a reinforcement to the behaviour they have carried out. The act is also always outside the rules of the game they are playing. Using football as an example again, if there was a player on the opposition and that player disliked them, maybe because they'd had issues off the pitch, and they purposely stuck their foot out in order to cause the player to fall and injure themselves when the ball was nowhere near them in play, that would be seen as hostile aggression. So in that situation, this aggression can often be reactive to an emotional stimulus. So in this case, that player disliking the opposition. A large negative to a player action like this is that it disrupts the dynamic between the team and often their own and team performance. Another type of aggression is instrumental aggression, which is stated by Todd, Thatcher and Rahman again. Aggression which holds focus on completing a competitive goal through harmful means. So the intent to cause harm is still there, and it is not within the rules of the game, but it is a calculated act and centered around achieving something to help them in the sport.
Could you elaborate with an example of this in sport?
So using the same example again, except the opposition player is their star player. So the player goes out intentionally to harm them in order to give their team a better chance of winning. In other words, the goal is non-aggressive, but the action is.
Is there a form of aggression that is carried out within the rules of the game?
Yes, in fact there is. It is known as assertion or channeled aggression. Bredemir said that assertive behaviour can improve performance and is where a player will play within the rules of the sport at very high intensity but will have no intention to harm the opponent. So the player will play to their highest ability in order to gain more advantage. This type of behaviour can require a large amount of self-control, as if they had to go hard and an incident did take place, it could easily escalate further to become a hostile situation. Again, using football, if somebody completed a legal tackle and the opposition fell over, and they then managed to run through 3 other players and score, this would be seen as assertion.
Now you've explained the types of aggression, could you elaborate on how aggression is interpreted in different sports?
Acts of aggression, depending on the sport, should be interpreted differently. In other words, in some sports aggression is seen as a norm, but in others it is not. This was also said by Wiggins James et al. They said, it is important to realise that acts of aggression may be interpreted differently depending on the nature of the sport. As a simple example, football, it would not be seen as an acceptable norm to punch somebody in the face, but in boxing, this is an acceptable norm. This can be referred to as a sanctioned aggression, meaning the action carries the intent to cause harm, but is in the rules of the sport.
What could cause or inhibit somebody from getting into a situation like the example used above in a match of football or any other sport where it is not accepted as the norm?
There is one particular person who can influence players a lot when it comes to aggression, and that's their coach. In order to avoid aggressive outbursts of either instrumental aggression or hostile, especially as these two carry the intent to harm, the coach should discourage this at all costs, no matter what the situation. However, this is not always the case. Depending on things such as the atmosphere, level of play, or the coach's morals, sometimes they can encourage aggressive behaviour, but this does not always carry the intent to cause harm. They could simply be trying to cause the players to feel aggressive in order to gain assertion, so that the players compete to their highest level of ability.
If the coach has influence, surely the players must too.
Absolutely. The experience of the players themselves definitely plays a part. The more experienced the player, the more instrumental aggression is used and less hostile. They also develop self-control and they learn over the years of playing sport.
You said that less hostile aggression takes place when an athlete is more experienced, but if there was hostile aggression, what could cause it?
There are multiple causes of aggression, some of which I've already touched on, such as having ill feelings towards another player on the opposition. One factor could be an influence outside of the sport. If a player has relationship problems with a partner going on at home, their anger about the situation could come out during a match. It does not have to always be something within the sport that causes the aggression. Some more obvious ones would be the pressure to win, or a disagreement with the referee, or just simply retaliating from a situation such as a legal or illegal tackle that ends up with the player on the floor, and they then become aggressive towards the opposition player who caused them to fall over.
Are there any theories that could explain where this aggression comes from before the cause actually takes place?
There are four main theories that can be used to explain aggression: instinct theory, social learning theory, frustration aggression hypothesis, and aggressive cue hypothesis.
Could you please give some details on these theories?
Yes, I will start with instinct theory. It was originally developed by Freud and Lorenz. They believe that we are born with innate or genetic drives to be aggressive. In Freud's psychodynamic approach, he discusses three parts of the mind, one of which is the id, and he claims that a trait of violence is embedded into this part of the human mind. In terms of athletes, they state that if an athlete is going to act aggressively, it will build up over time before it is actually released, which therefore means we should always be able to predict their behaviour. They also recognise that when aggression takes place in sport, it can be a displacement for the real cause of their aggression. So the id urges are acted upon, but not to the cause of their anger, so the sport is a displaced form of aggression. Instinct theory also says that aggression can often be turned into something socially acceptable, such as sports that require control, such as judo. When this takes place, they reach catharsis, but for example, they perform an act that is not socially acceptable, they will then become aggressive. Using a sporting example of football again, if a player was having issues on the pitch, if they took their anger out on the ball by booting it, they would reach catharsis. But if they decide to get on and punch up with another player, that would lead to aggression. However, as a theory, this comes with a few criticisms, one of which is stated by Berkowitz, which said levels of aggression actually tend to increase in sport, not decrease, as Freud suggests. For example, when playing sports, people are much more aroused and alert, which is when aggression is more likely to take place. If everyone was relaxed whilst playing sport, one, the play would not be as good, but clearly less aggressive behaviour would take place. Other simple criticisms are that there has never been any innate aggressive traits to be found in anyone, and most sports people do not carry on their aggressive practices when in society. Finally, people learn aggressive behaviour, meaning it would not be innate. The next theory we'll look at is social learning theory, which links to the last criticism of instinct theory. This theory suggests that all behaviour is learnt through observational learning, so therefore, so is aggression. An individual will observe a role model and pay attention to their behaviour. They will then retain that information, and if the person is rewarded through vicarious reinforcement, they will have the motivation to complete the behaviour and will reproduce it. A significant piece of research was carried out for this theory, which was Bangero's Bobo doll experiment. He gathered a large group of nursery children aged 3 to 5 and split them into 3 categories evenly with boys and girls. The first group saw an adult behave aggressively towards the Bobo doll, the second saw an adult behave neutrally, and finally the last group was a control group who saw no adult behaviour. The experiment showed that children imitate the behaviour of the adults, so in the aggressive category, they behaved aggressively. For example, if an amateur netball player saw a professional player trip another player up in a match and receive praise from their teammates for doing so, that amateur player would then imitate that behaviour in their next match in the hope of also receiving praise. However, like every theory, it comes with criticisms, one of which is that you cannot be certain that an individual is imitating that person's behaviour. There is often a delay between paying attention to the behaviour and reproducing it, so it's not 100% certain if that is why they show that behaviour. Not all behaviour is bad, so good behaviour could be reproduced as well, and also people have free will, so if they do not believe that behaviour is good, they will not imitate it. The next theory is the frustration-aggression hypothesis, which states that every time a player feels or gets frustrated, this will lead to it being expressed by aggression. Dollard stated that aggression occurs because frustration arises due to a goal blockage. If the aggressive act they carry out is successful, they will then reach catharsis, but if it is not successful and they are punished for it, then more frustration will build up and therefore more aggression. A sporting example may be in rugby, for example. A player from the losing team performs an illegal tackle due to being frustrated about them losing and injures the opposition. But the referee takes it as an accident. This would lead to catharsis, but if the referee was not to say that and punish them, it would lead to further aggression. Again, this theory is easily criticised. There is not much support, especially since they're suggesting that every situation where there is frustration, it will lead to aggression. Also, it doesn't state that it is different for different people. It just assumes we would all react in the same way, and they do not discuss strategies people may have to deal with feelings of frustration. From this theory, they also do not account for the idea of aggression being learned, as it suggests that it happens with feelings of frustration. The final theory is the aggressive cue hypothesis. This theory also relates to frustration. They suggest that frustration makes the player ready for an aggressive situation, and not that it will lead to aggressive behaviour. Frustration increases a player's arousal and gets them ready for an aggressive cue from the environment. For example, if a footballer tackled a player from the opposition and that player fell over and then became hostile towards them and was shouting abuse and punching them, this would be an aggressive environmental cue, and the player would then also become aggressive. But if the player who was tripped up did not react, and the other players would not become aggressive, so there was no aggressive cue. The same criticisms apply to this theory as the criticisms of frustration-aggression hypothesis.
Thank you for that. You mentioned in the last theory an aggressive environmental stimulus. Is there any way to know what stimuli will affect a competitor or player?
There is not necessarily a definitive way of knowing, but there are definitely benefits of the coach having an idea of what makes their athletes aggressive, especially in team sports. One simple example could be one player of a netball team has a very aggressive disposition and could sometimes show during matches. That player's coach could then work with her to develop strategies to enable her to deal with these feelings of aggression. It is important for any coach to know the traits of their players, and if one of them is aggressive, they must work out with them to contain it rather than show it, especially in non-contact sports.
You said about a coach giving strategies. Could you explain some of these strategies?
Yes, but in fact it's not just the coaches who need strategies to deal with aggressive behaviour. Officials and spectators do too. We will start by looking at a strategy that players can use for themselves. A very simple one is count to 10. This allows players to try and relax their minds and not think about the aggressive cue they are facing. A strategy a coach could then use to discourage aggressive behaviour in their performers would be to punish the aggressive players. For example, in a match a player punches another player, that player who threw the punch would be put on the bench for the next 3 matches. There are then some more general strategies that can be used by spectators, officials, or even the governing bodies. Spectators, although it's unlikely to not happen, they could reduce the amount of alcohol they consume. That would help to prevent an incident between opposition fans. Another simple thing that officials or referees could do is to make sure that they apply the rules fairly and consistently to avoid aggressive situations. If everyone feels they are being treated the same, there is less chance of a player becoming aggressive towards a referee. Finally, the governing bodies of the sport can be put in place strict rules and fines about any aggressive behaviour as a deterrent for players to be aggressive.
Thank you for talking to us today. That's all we have time for, unfortunately. It has been very interesting.